You know, it's funny. You hear that old line from Shakespeare about a name being just a name, right? That a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. But when you look at India, um, names feel like so much more than just labels. They're steeped in history, culture, and, let's be honest, a fair bit of politics.
That's a really insightful way to begin.
Okay.
You're spot on. Here, a name can act as a powerful marker. It can instantly bring to mind specific eras, connect people to particular narratives, and even signal shifts in the prevailing cultural or political winds.
Absolutely. And if you've been paying attention over the last 10 years or so, you've probably noticed a pretty significant trend in this name-changing arena, particularly when it comes to the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP. They've been quite active in reshaping the map in a way. To take Allahabad, for instance, now it's Prayagraj.
Yeah.
Faizabad has become Ayodhya, and Aurangabad, well, that's now known as Chhatrapati Sambhajinagar.
Mm-hmm.
Even a museum being built in Agra, which was originally conceived to highlight Mughal history, is now going to be named after Shivaji.
And these aren't just cosmetic alterations, for a new map. Each renaming carries its own weight, its own underlying story. The move from Allahabad to Prayagraj, for example, is often presented as a reclaiming of an ancient identity, perhaps a connection to Hindu heritage.
Yeah.
Similarly, the renaming of Aurangabad can be seen by some as an assertion of Maratha identity, a deliberate step away from a historical figure associated with Mughal rule.
Right. And the latest instance of this trend that really caught my attention is the WAQF Amendment Bill. It's been given a brand new moniker, UMEED. Now, UMEED is an Urdu word, and rather ironically, it translates to hope.
The irony there is indeed quite sharp, isn't it? Especially when you dig into the substance of the bill itself. To rebrand legislation that amends an existing act concerning religious endowments with such an aspirational term as hope, well, it certainly suggests a specific framing, a particular message the government intends to convey. Beyond the obvious irony, could this name be like a deliberate attempt to soften potential opposition or frame the bill as progressive, despite its potential impact on existing management structures?
Exactly my thought. And that's where our deep dive for you really begins.
Yep.
We want to get under the skin of this renaming trend, particularly as it relates to the UMEED bill and how it connects to something very real and tangible, land ownership. Because this isn't just about symbolic gestures on a map or in legislative titles, is it?
Not at all. When we talk about WAQF properties, we're discussing a truly substantial amount of land. Across India, there are approximately 870,000 registered WAQF properties, encompassing a staggering 940,000 acres.
Wow.
To really put that in perspective for you, that's an area roughly the size of the state of Delaware in the U.S. It just highlights the sheer economic and social power potentially tied to these properties.
That's huge.
Yeah. The WAC is actually the third largest landholder in the country, surpassed only by Indian Railways and the Armed Forces. That's a massive portfolio of land.
The third largest.
Yeah, dedicated to religious, educational, and other beneficial purposes under Islamic law. Just to clarify, under Islamic law, a WAC is essentially an inalienable charitable endowment, typically land or property, dedicated for those purposes.
Okay, so this isn't just about changing a few names on signposts or a bill title. We're talking about a significant chunk of India's land ownership. So what exactly does this UMEED bill do in relation to these WAC properties? What kind of hope are we actually looking at here?
Well, the bill introduces several key changes to the existing WAC Act of 1995. Firstly, as you pointed out, the Act itself will now be known by this new, rather lengthy title, the Unified WAC Management Empowerment, Efficiency, and Development Act, or UMEED.
Right.
The stated intention, at least on the surface, seems to be focused on streamlining and enhancing the management of these properties.
Right, because a longer name always guarantees better efficiency, doesn't it? But setting aside the name change of the Act itself, what other significant shifts does this bill bring about concerning the WAC properties themselves?
Okay, well, one of the most notable changes concerns who holds the authority to determine whether a property is indeed a WACDRO property. Under the previous act, the WAC board played a significant role in this determination. However, the UMEED bill appears to shift this authority. While the full details of who will now hold this power require a close reading of the complete legislation, this change in determining the status of a property has potentially far-reaching implications for the control and administration of these lands.
That sounds like a potentially seismic shift in power. If the WAC board no longer has the final say on what constitutes a WAC property, who does? And wouldn't that create potential for, politically motivated reclassifications? What safeguards might be in place or needed to prevent that? What could be the wider consequences of such a change?
Those are precisely the crucial questions to be asking. Depending on where this authority is vested, it could indeed lead to a reevaluation of the status of numerous properties. This is where the direct link to land ownership becomes undeniably clear. If the criteria for determining WAQF's status are altered, or if a different body gains the power to make that determination, well, it could fundamentally change the legal standing of these vast land holdings.
Right.
We might see legal challenges arise depending on how this shift in authority is implemented and interpreted.
And it doesn't stop there, does it? I also came across information suggesting that the bill addresses government properties that currently hold WAQF status. What's the situation with those?
Yes, that's another really key aspect of this bill. The UMEED bill proposes that government properties that were previously designated as WAQF properties will now lose that status.
Lose their status.
Okay. The underlying rationale for this isn't entirely transparent from the information readily available, but it could potentially free up significant tracts of land currently under WAQF jurisdiction. That's a significant move with potentially huge ramifications for land use and historical preservation, isn't it?
Absolutely. So we're looking at a potential change in who gets to decide what qualifies as WAQF land, coupled with the removal of WAQF status from existing government properties. That paints a picture of a rather significant reshaping of the land ownership landscape. Now, the bill also mentions changes to the Central WAQF Council, right? Something about including non-Muslims and women?
That's correct. The bill proposes the inclusion of non-Muslim members in the Central WAQF Council, which historically has been composed primarily of Muslims. Furthermore, it mandates that at least 2 women must be part of the council.
Okay.
On the surface, this appears to be a move towards greater inclusivity and broader representation within the central body that oversees WAQF matters at the national level.
And while inclusivity is generally viewed positively, we need to consider the timing and the broader context, don't we? It's easy to frame these changes as progressive and modernizing reforms, but could they also serve other purposes within the larger political strategy?
Absolutely. When you consider these changes in their entirety, the renaming of the act, the potential shift in determining WAQF status, the removal of WAQF status for government properties, and the altered composition of the Central WAQF Council, a pattern does begin to emerge. It suggests a move towards greater government oversight and potentially more direct control over these substantial land assets.
Okay, let's take a step back for a moment and look at the broader context of renaming that you mentioned earlier. This isn't the first instance of a political party in India engaging in this practice, is it?
Not at all, no.
The information suggests that the BJP has been quite active in this area over the past decade. And this isn't a tactic unique to one party, is it? We've seen similar instances throughout Indian political history where, for example, the renaming of the Indira Gandhi International Airport or the Rajiv Gandhi Stadium served a similar purpose, perhaps, of shaping public memory and establishing a particular legacy.
Indeed. The renaming of places like Allahabad, Faizabad, and Aurangabad are prominent examples of this trend under the current government. These actions are often justified as attempts to correct historical injustices or to reclaim what is seen as authentic cultural heritage. The renaming of the Mughal Museum to a Shivaji Museum in Agra, for example, aligns with a narrative that emphasizes certain historical figures and perhaps downplays the significance of others.
It really does seem like these aren't just random, isolated incidents of renaming, but rather deliberate actions with underlying political motivations. The information even suggests that between 2014 and 2024, numerous government schemes that were originally launched by the Congress Party were also rebranded with new names.
That's a fairly common political strategy globally, actually. New administrations often seek to associate themselves with existing programs or to signal a new direction by giving them a fresh identity. In the Indian context, examples like the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, which had earlier iterations, and the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao Yojana, which built upon previous initiatives, illustrate this point. Even urban development projects have seen this kind of rebranding over time.
It's often said that it's like putting old wine in new bottles, right? But what do you think is the core motivation behind this fairly consistent pattern of rebranding? Is it purely about public perception and optics, or are there deeper strategic objectives at play?
There are likely a number of factors driving this. Firstly, renaming can be a very effective tool for shaping collective memory and promoting a particular historical narrative. By changing a name, you can subtly influence the focus and the associations people have with a place, a person, or a policy.
Yeah, makes sense.
Secondly, It allows the ruling party to assert ownership of initiatives and strengthen their own brand identity. When schemes are rebranded, it can create the impression of new action and innovative ideas, even if the fundamental work is a continuation of efforts from previous administrations.
And when we focus specifically on the UMEED bill and the WAF properties, the stakes seem particularly high given the sheer scale of the land involved. The information I encountered even mentioned a rather strong statement suggesting that without this amendment, there could have been potential for even the Parliament building to be claimed as WAF property. That sounds quite dramatic, doesn't it?
While that particular statement might be an instance of hyperbole used for rhetorical impact, it does underscore the government's stated concern regarding the potential for what they perceive as unwarranted claims on properties under the existing WAQF Act.
Oh, okay.
This kind of rhetoric can be employed to generate public support for the amendments by creating a sense of urgency or highlighting a perceived threat, you see.
So when we piece it all together, the renaming of the WAF Act to UMEED, along with the other proposed changes within the bill, seems to align with this broader strategy of rebranding, and perhaps a desire for greater oversight and control over significant resources, in this case, land.
Precisely. The analysis suggests that this goes beyond mere administrative adjustments or modernization efforts. It appears to be fundamentally about influence over land ownership and influence over the dominant historical narrative. By renaming and restructuring the management of WAF properties, the current government can potentially reshape the landscape of land ownership and influence how this history is understood and remembered.
Okay, so to recap for you, we've explored how the UMEED bill renames the WAF Act and introduces changes to who decides if a property qualifies as WAF, potentially leading to the removal of that status from government-held lands and altering the composition of the Central WAF Council. We've also connected this to a wider trend of renaming by the BJP and other political parties throughout Indian history as a tool for shaping narratives and establishing political legacies.
And it's so important to remember that these actions, while they might sometimes be presented as purely administrative or symbolic, have very real-world consequences, especially when they intersect with something as fundamental as land ownership. The full implications of these shifts in power and narrative will likely become clearer over time.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps the most crucial point for you to really consider. When names change, whether it's a place, a piece of legislation, or even a museum, who are the real beneficiaries? And what deeper shifts in power dynamics and historical narratives accompany these alterations? Take some time to think critically about the long-term implications of such rebranding efforts, looking beyond the immediate news headlines, and considering the lasting impact on history, ownership, and the stories we tell ourselves as a nation.